In 1995, a beer-bellied brawler knocked his opponent so unconscious that the man started convulsing in the octagon. The fighter responsible? He just stood there laughing. This wasn't your typical martial artist. This was Tank Abbott. And he was about to become the UFC's most feared street fighter. Big, bearded, and brutal, Tank was terrifying in the early days of the UFC. He wasn't here to play by the rules or adhere to martial arts philosophies. No, Tank had one simple approach. Walk in, swing hard, and watch him drop. And believe it or not, that approach worked. For a while, he was one of the scariest men in the UFC. Why? Because you couldn't predict what he would do next. Not even he knew half the time. Early life. Tank Abbott wasn't like the fighters of today. He didn't grow up mastering some ancient art. He grew up in rough neighborhoods, learning to survive by any means necessary. And that's what made him so dangerous. He fought not for glory or belts, he fought because that's who he was. Tank Abbott was the ultimate anti-hero of MMA, the guy who wasn't afraid to bring the spirit of a street fight into the cage. And for a while, he tore through the UFC with brute force and sheer aggression that no one could match. To understand Tank Abbott's menace in the Octagon, you have to go back to Huntington Beach, California. While it might sound like a surfer's paradise, in the 80s it had a darker edge, a town where street brawls were as common as beach bonfires. And right there in the middle of it all was David Abbott, a young man born into a world where strength meant everything. If you wanted respect, you fought for it. And Tank fought for it a lot. Growing up, he didn't exactly take the traditional route. While other kids were taking karate classes or getting into organized sports, Tank was learning the rules of the street, where every punch had to count and every fight could be your last. By his teens, he was known as one of the toughest kids around. Even when Tank found his way to wrestling in high school and college, it was clear that he was different. For a guy with his mindset, wrestling offered a blend of aggression and control, but it was almost too controlled. He learned the basics, grappling, holds, takedowns, but he was always itching to break free of the rules. When college wrestling ended, Tank headed back to Huntington Beach, looking for something bigger and rawer. The origins of Tank, first fights, and the path to the UFC. After college, Tank didn't waste any time finding action. By the early 90s, he'd become a well-known face in the underground fighting scene around Southern California. These weren't regulated fights with rules or referees. These were down and dirty brawls where anything went. He fought in bars, basements, parking lots, wherever he could find someone willing to throw hands. Tank was a natural-born brawler. His fighting style? No nonsense, unrefined, and brutal. The guy didn't care about jabs or fancy footwork. He'd go in swinging, aiming for the knockout, and shrug off any other punches that came his way. It didn't take long for him to build a reputation. People started calling him Tank because he'd walk right through his opponents like an armored vehicle, shrugging off punches and throwing his own like they were cannonballs. But by the time the UFC came calling, Tank was a legend in his own right, feared by anyone who had ever faced him. But the UFC wasn't sure what to make of him. This wasn't a guy who cared about technique. He was raw power, raw aggression, raw everything. But that's what made him so perfect for the early days of MMA, a sport that was as much about raw energy as it was about skill. Tank's arrival in the UFC. When Tank entered the UFC in 1995, he was stepping into a world that was still figuring itself out. Back then, the UFC was the Wild West of fighting. You had karate experts, judo masters, wrestlers, all coming in with their own philosophies and techniques. But Tank, he was the outlier. He wasn't here to prove that his style was better. He was here to bulldoze anyone who got in his way. Tank's debut was against John Matua, a mountain of a man with a traditional Hawaiian fighting background. Matua was tough, no question about it, but Tank was on another level that night. The fight barely lasted a minute. Tank came out swinging, and within seconds, Matua was out cold. Fans in the audience went wild. They had never seen anything like it. This wasn't controlled violence. This was pure, explosive aggression.
That was Matua.
No. Matua laid out like this.
That was a stand-in for Shamrock.
The fight wasn't just a win for Tank, it was a message to the entire UFC. He was here to make an impact, to bring a kind of brutality that MMA hadn't seen yet. And the fans, they loved it. Suddenly, Tank Abbott wasn't just another fighter, he was a sensation, the guy who'd bring the energy of a bar fight to the Octagon. The UFC 6 tournament. Now, Tank didn't stop there. In the same year, he entered the UFC 6 tournament, where he'd have to fight multiple opponents in one night to win. Now, Tank was used to street fights, but this was a whole new level. Still, he was unfazed. To him, it was just another chance to swing for the fences. His first opponent was Paul Verhoeven, a 6'8" giant with a background in pit fighting. But size didn't matter to Tank. He charged in, relentless, throwing heavy punches and eventually taking him down. Each fight in that tournament was like watching a storm unfold. Tank would unleash a barrage of punches and barely stopping to breathe. He fought like he didn't care about technique or stamina. All he cared about was ending things quickly. And usually that's exactly what he did. Tank's performance in UFC 6 was the stuff of legend. He became the fighter to watch, the one who brought a new level of unpredictability to the Octagon. People either loved him or hated him, but they couldn't look away. By the end of the night, Tank was the UFC's biggest star, not because he was the best fighter, but because he was the wildest. Tank Abbott's persona and fan reaction. Tank Abbott wasn't just a fighter. He was a personality, a larger-than-life figure who didn't care what people thought of him. His cockiness was unmatched. He'd drink beer during interviews, poke fun at his opponents, and taunt the crowds like he was on a wrestling stage instead of in a sport where people were supposed to show respect. To Tank, this wasn't just fighting, it was theater. He wasn't just brash, he was ruthless with his words. If he thought his opponent was weak, he'd say it. If he thought the crowd was boring, he'd call them out. Some people loved him for it. They saw him as this breath of fresh air, someone who didn't take himself or the sport too seriously. But others, well, they thought he was a disgrace, a bad influence who was giving MMA a terrible name. The media wasn't sure what to make of him either. On one hand, he was a gift. His sound bites and antics gave them headlines and drew in curious viewers. But on the other, he was divisive. Some critics felt he was tarnishing the sport, turning it into a spectacle when they were trying to build its credibility. But Tank, he didn't care one bit. He was here to fight, to entertain, and to be himself. And for every person who hated him, there was a fan who loved him for his authenticity. Tank wasn't just controversial in the ring. He carried that wild persona everywhere he went. Stories circulated about him getting into fights outside the Octagon, in bars, at parties, even on the street. He was a street fighter at heart, and that attitude followed him everywhere. He didn't just want to beat people, he wanted to humiliate them. And if they crossed him outside the cage, he'd deal with it the same way he did in the ring, with fists flying. For Tank, the line between sport and real life didn't exist. He was a brawler through and through, and fans knew it. Whether they loved him or hated him, everyone watched, wondering what he would do next. Because with Tank Abbott, there was always a next. Tank's decline and the UFCs Evolution. Tank's career, like every fighter's, wasn't just about wins. As the UFC evolved, fighters were starting to come in with specialized training, refined techniques, and serious conditioning. This new generation wasn't just tough, they were smart. They trained for weeks, studying their opponents and honing their skills, while Tank just came in swinging, same as always. Tank was still dangerous, But pure toughness wasn't enough anymore. He'd get gassed out, caught in submissions, and outmatched by fighters who had all the power but twice the skill. It was like watching a bulldozer trying to keep up with race cars. Fighters like Vitor Belfort and Maurice Smith brought techniques that Tank couldn't counter. They were fast, smart, and knew how to capitalize on his weaknesses. These weren't just losses, they were wake-up calls that the UFC was no longer the Wild West. It was becoming a sport of skill, discipline, and strategy, and Tank's style just didn't fit anymore. But Tank wasn't ready to accept it. Even as the losses piled up, he kept coming back, fighting with that same reckless abandon that had made him famous. For him, each fight was still a street brawl, and he would be damned if he was going to change. Tank Abbott's transition to entertainment. As Tank's fighting career began to slow down, he found a new avenue for his larger-than-life personality: professional wrestling. In the early 2000s, he made his way into World Championship Wrestling, bringing his signature cockiness and Street Fighter style with him. Wrestling fans saw the same wild, reckless spirit in Tank that MMA fans had fallen in love with years earlier. After WCW, Tank made an appearance for NWA Wildside in December 2000, where he teamed up with Kevin Northcutt in a memorable tag team bout against Bob Sapp and Stone Mountain in Cornelia, Georgia. Even though he lost that night, Tank's presence was still a big draw, proving that his name alone could bring fans to the arena. He was a performer at heart, and he leaned into his own mythos, reveling in the role of the anti-hero. In pro wrestling, Tank didn't have to worry about conditioning or technique. He just had to bring that same wild, unpredictable energy that made him famous in the UFC. And he did just that. But Tank wasn't ready to completely leave the world of fighting behind. On August 15, 2008, Tank returned to the ring one last time in Tokyo, Japan, for the Inoki Genome Federation. In this final showdown, he faced off against UFC fighter Josh Barnett. Tank lost that fight, but he went out on his own terms, a street brawler who never compromised his style, no matter where he fought. Even in Japan, Tank remained true to himself. His fighting spirit hadn't faded, even if his speed and stamina had. That night in Tokyo, fans got to see the last of the old-school street fighter, a man who had left a lasting mark on the world of MMA and beyond. Tank Abbott and popular media. Tank Abbott's impact didn't stop at fighting. His fame carried over into pop culture. In 1997, he appeared as himself in the iconic TV show Friends, going head-to-head with Jon Favreau's character, billionaire Pete Becker. Becker was dating Monica, and he had a dream to be an MMA fighter. But in the show, Tank proved to him just how brutal that dream could be, knocking him out in the ring. It was funny and an iconic moment, especially considering how Friends is still one of the most popular sitcoms on Netflix. This appearance put Tank in front of millions of mainstream viewers who may have never even seen him in a UFC bout.
And I said, "What's that?" Because at that point in time, I wasn't watching sitcoms even to this day. And I'm like, "What the hell is that?" They're going
to get home watching that.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm like going, "What the hell is this?" He goes, "That's the biggest show on TV." And Robin Williams and who else? Somebody else. Billy Chris. Billy. No, this is the same episode.
Oh.
Robin Williams. It was the Sweeps Week episode.
What happened after he retired? After retiring from fighting, Tank's life took a dramatic turn. He loved partying and openly acknowledged that alcohol became a significant part of his life. Friends would often warn him about the risks, but Tank admits he felt indestructible, thinking nothing could touch him. Unfortunately, those warnings proved true, and he eventually faced a severe health crisis. Tank went through both liver and kidney transplants. During surgery, he actually flatlined 5 times at the renowned Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Beverly Hills. And it wasn't just close calls. He experienced 6 strokes, leaving him in a long and difficult recovery. Talk about fighting for your life. Although it has been a tough road, Tank has made impressive progress. He jokes that his cognitive abilities are at least on par with Tito Ortiz's these days, but he's still working on getting back to full strength. He's regaining his focus and tackling everyday challenges like memory lapses, but he's resilient and his cognitive function is steadily improving. Legacy and final thoughts. So what did Tank Abbott leave behind? He gave us a reminder that sometimes fighting isn't about belts or techniques. It's about showing up, swinging hard, and fighting like you mean it. Tank wasn't the champion, but he was something else. He was the guy who made fans sit up and take notice, who brought the chaos and unpredictability that early MMA needed. This beer-drinking, street-fighting legend showed us all that sometimes raw power and pure will are all you need to make history.